In our village, we were taught that a woman's life is like a clay pot, beautiful, functional, but easily shattered if handled with anything less than absolute caution. Amara was the finest of these pots. Born into the rhythmic heartbeat of rural Kenya, she was a creature of the red earth, her future seemingly sealed by the traditional expectations of the elders and the promises of a boy named Kofi. She stood under the ancient acacia tree, eyes bright, with the innocent arrogance of youth, believing that marriage was a destination rather than a journey. She saw the city as a distant gold mine that would merely fund her village dreams. She had no way of knowing that the man she loved would become the wind that blew the fire, or that the fragile clay of her soul was actually tempered steel. This is the story of a girl who died in the flames of betrayal so that a woman could rise from the embers. A woman who realized that a broken seal isn't a tragedy, but an opening to a world without limits. My name is Amara, and this is my story. I remember the day I married Kofi. The air in the village smelled of petrichor, that sweet, intoxicating scent of rain hitting dry earth. I was 18, draped in a white lace dress that my mother had saved for since I was a child. I felt like a queen. When Kofi took my hand, his palms were sweaty, and his eyes held a promise that felt as solid as the mountains surrounding our valley. Amara, he whispered under the giant acacia tree, I will give you a life the stars will envy. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? I was a village girl who had topped her class, full of dreams but grounded in tradition. When our twin girls, Zuri and Zalika, arrived a year later, my world felt complete. They were identical miracles, with eyes like obsidian and laughs that sounded like silver bells. But love, I soon learned, doesn't put food on the table. The village was drying up. The maize was stunted. The night Kofi told me he had to leave for Nairobi, I cried until my pillow was soaked. I held him so tight I thought I'd leave bruises. It's for the girls, he said, packing a tattered suitcase. I'll find a job in a big firm. I'll send for you. Just wait for me, Amara. Wait for the harvest. I stood at the edge of the red dirt road, holding 2 infants, watching the bus exhaust swallow the man I loved. I didn't know then that the man who left that day would never truly come back. The city doesn't just change your clothes. It eats your soul if you are not careful. The first year was a fever dream of hope. Every time the mail runner approached our gate, my heart would drum against my ribs like a trapped bird. Kofi's letters were thick, smelling of city smog and expensive ink. He sent money, more than I had ever held, and I would press the banknotes to my nose, trying to catch a lingering scent of him. I spent my days as a ghost of his memory, walking the paths we once trod, telling the twins stories of the lion of the city who was building them a palace. But as the second year bled into the third, the letters thinned. The ink became dry, the words mechanical. Work is hard, he would write. The city is expensive. Be patient. Patience is a bitter tea, and I drank it until my stomach turned. The money began to falter. First a week late, then a month, then nothing but excuses. I watched my mother-in-law, a woman whose face was a roadmap of a hard life, begin to look at me with a pity that burned worse than anger. She saw the light fading from my eyes. She saw me thinning, my collarbones sharpening into blades. Amara, she said one evening as we shelled peas by the fading light. A man who finds a new sun often forgets the moon that stayed at home. I refused to believe her. I threw myself into work to drown out the silence. I started my first business, not out of ambition, but out of desperation. I walked 10 miles to the wholesale market at dawn, balancing 50 pounds of secondhand clothes on my head. I sold them door to door, my feet blistering, my back aching until I couldn't stand straight. I became a creature of labor. I fried mandatsi until the smell of hot oil was etched into my skin, all to ensure my daughters didn't feel the hunger that was gnawing at my soul. Then came the phone calls, the few that connected. His voice had changed. The soft, rhythmic lilt of our mother tongue was replaced by a sharp, hurried city slang. He sounded like a stranger wearing my husband's vocal cords. Kofi, I pleaded one night, the wind howling through the cracks in our mud-walled kitchen. The girls are asking for you. They don't know your face anymore. Just come for a weekend. I can't, Amara. Do you think money grows on the pavement here? I'm exhausted. I'm doing this for you. The lie tasted like copper in my mouth. I knew then. I didn't have proof, but a wife's heart is a finely tuned instrument. It can hear the dissonance in a symphony of lies long before the first false note is played. I felt the distance growing, not in miles, but in the cold, vast emptiness of his indifference. I was no longer his partner. I was a chore he was failing to complete. The bus ride to Nairobi was a 12-hour descent into a hell I had built in my imagination. Every bump in the road sent a jolt of nausea through me. I clutched my small bag, containing a fresh shirt for Kofi, a drawing Zuri had made of a daddy who was just a stick figure with a crown, and the last of my secret savings. When I arrived, the city screamed at me. The gray smoke, the screeching tires, the sea of people who looked right through me. I felt like a speck of dust. I called him from a borrowed phone, my voice trembling. Amara? Why are you here? His voice wasn't filled with joy. It was filled with panic. I told you. I'm at the coast on a massive project. I'm 400 kilometers away. Why didn't you stay in the village? He sounded so convincing that for a moment, I felt like a monster for doubting him. He told me he'd M-Pesa me money for a hotel and a bus ticket back at dawn. Go eat, rest, and go home, Amara. Don't make this difficult. Hungry and hollow, I wandered into a mid-sized restaurant near the terminal. I just wanted to sit in a corner and disappear. I ordered a plate of rice I couldn't afford to swallow. And then, the bell above the door chimed. Kofi walked in. He looked magnificent. He wore a suit that cost more than my mother-in-law's house. But it wasn't the suit that broke me. It was the way he was looking at the woman on his arm. It was a look of adoration, of worship, the look he used to give me under the acacia tree. She was beautiful in a way that made me feel like a pile of rags. He pulled out her chair, leaning in to whisper something that made her throw her head back in a melodic, expensive laugh. I sat frozen, a spoonful of rice halfway to my mouth. He was right there, 10 feet away. The man who claimed to be at the coast was ordering wine and touching the hand of a stranger. I didn't cause a scene. I couldn't. My throat had closed up so tight I thought I would suffocate. I stood up, wrapped my shawl tight around my shaking frame, and walked out into the rain. I spent 2 days at my brother Malik's house in a silent trance. Malik didn't ask questions. He saw the wreckage in my eyes. On the second night, he sat me down in front of a glowing computer screen. Amara, he said, his voice hard as flint. You can go back to the village and die of a broken heart. Or you can learn to build a world where you never have to ask a man for a cent again. Look at this screen. This is the future. Choose. I stared at the blinking cursor. My heart was a graveyard. But my mind was beginning to catch fire. I spent the next 48 hours learning a trade I didn't know existed, fueled by a cold, crystalline rage that I returned to the village 3 days later. I didn't tell Kofi I had seen him. I didn't tell his mother. I gave myself exactly 90 days. 90 days to see if he would confess. 90 days to see if the man I loved still existed somewhere under that expensive suit. That on the 89th day, he called. Not to say he was coming home, but to say the money would be even less this month. I understand, I said, my voice as smooth as a river stone. Do what you have to do, Kofi. I hung up, walked to my bedroom, and pulled out the suitcases I had hidden under the bed. I called Malik. The 90 days are up. Come tomorrow. And bring the truck. That night, I didn't sleep. I watched the moon crawl across the sky, waiting for the dawn that would change everything. But as the sun began to peek over the horizon, I heard a sound that made my blood turn to ice. The car was pulling into the courtyard. Not Malik's truck. A sleek, silver sedan. I looked out the window and saw Kofi stepping out. But he wasn't alone. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the door for the woman from the restaurant. He wasn't just visiting. He was bringing the city and his betrayal straight into my sanctuary. My heart hammered against my ribs like a prisoner beating on a cell door. I stood behind the tattered lace curtain of my bedroom, watching them. Kofi looked around the courtyard with a proprietary air, as if he still owned the air I breathed. The woman, Sarah, stepped out of the car gingerly, her high heels sinking into the soft red earth of my home. She looked at my flower pots, the ones I had tended with the same care I gave my children, with a look of mild disgust, as if the very dust of my life was a contagion. Amara, Kofi shouted, his voice booming with a false, terrifying cheerfulness. Mama, come see who I've brought. I felt a coldness settle over me, a physical weight that steadied my hands. I walked out onto the porch, my daughters clutching my skirt. My mother-in-law emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes wide with a confusion that quickly turned to a sharp, motherly intuition. "Amara," Kofi said, stepping forward. He didn't try to kiss me. He didn't even look me in the eye. "This is Sarah. She's a senior partner at the firm. We're in the area for a land survey, and I thought it was time she saw where I come from. I told her you'd be happy to prepare some traditional lunch for us." He was using me. He was using my home, my labor, and my dignity to perform a village tour for his mistress. I looked at Sarah. Up close, I could see the cracks in her foundation, the way she couldn't meet my gaze, the way her hand trembled as she adjusted her designer sunglasses. She knew. She knew exactly whose life she was dismantling. "Welcome," I said. The word felt like a shard of glass in my throat, but I forced it out. I turned back to the kitchen. For the next hour, I moved like an ancient machine. I pounded the fufu, I stirred the stew, I served them. I watched Kofi play the big man, bragging about his city exploits while Sarah nodded, sipping bottled water she had brought herself. My mother-in-law sat in the corner, silent, her eyes darting between me and the suitcases she knew were packed inside. Every time Kofi laughed, I felt a thread of my old life snap. Snap. There goes the memory of our wedding. Snap. There goes the hope of a shared future. I was no longer a wife. I was an observer at my own funeral. "You're very quiet, Amara," Kofi said, wiping grease from his chin. "The city has made me realize how much you village folk miss out on. You should be grateful I'm out there making a way for us." I looked at him then. Really looked at him. I saw the greed in the corners of his mouth and the emptiness in his eyes. He wasn't a lion. He was a scavenger. "I am grateful, Kofi," I said, my voice low and vibrating with a power I didn't know I possessed. "I am grateful for the clarity you've given me today." Just then, the distant, heavy rumble of a diesel engine began to shake the ground. A cloud of white dust appeared at the end of the long driveway. It was Malik. He was early. Kofi stood up, squinting against the sun. "Who is that? Why is a transport truck coming here?" I stepped off the porch and walked toward the center of the courtyard. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look at the woman in the silk dress. I looked only at the dust. "That's my ride, Kofi," I said, his face contorted. "Your ride? To where?" "You're not going anywhere." He lunged for my arm, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. But as his hand closed around my wrist, the truck screeched to a halt, and Malik jumped out before the engine had even died. He wasn't alone. Two of his largest friends climbed out of the back, their faces set in grim masks. Kofi froze. He looked at the truck, then at the men, then at me. But it wasn't the men that stopped him. It was the look in my eyes, a look that told him I was already gone. "Pack the girls," I told Malik, my voice never wavering as the boxes were loaded. The silence was broken only by the sound of Sarah's car engine starting. She had seen enough. She was backing out, leaving Kofi standing alone in the middle of the chaos. Kofi turned to me, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Amara, think about the scandal. Think about your mother-in-law. You'll have nothing in the city. You'll starve within a week." I climbed into the cab of the truck and pulled the door shut. I looked down at him through the window. "I'd rather starve in my own truth than feast on your lies," I said as the truck began to move. I felt a sudden, violent jolt. The truck stalled. Malik swore, cranking the ignition, but the engine only groaned. I looked out the back window and saw something that made my heart stop. Kofi wasn't standing there anymore. He had disappeared into the house, and a moment later, a plume of thick, black smoke began to pour out of my bedroom window. The world turned into a screaming blur of orange and black. The smell hit me first, not the sweet scent of new rain, but the suffocating, oily stench of burning plastic and old wood. My bed, my clothes, the girls' dolls, everything I had painstakingly packed was in that room. "The girls," I shrieked, lunging for the door, but Malik's iron grip caught my waist. "They're in the truck, Amara. Stay back." I watched, paralyzed, as Kofi stumbled out of the front door, coughing, his expensive suit jacket singed at the edges. He wasn't trying to save anything. He stood in the yard, his eyes wild and bloodshot, watching the flames lick the roof. It was the act of a man who realized he couldn't control his treasure, so he decided to burn the map. "If you're leaving," he wheezed, a terrifying grin stretching across his face, "you leave with nothing. Just like you started." I looked at the fire, and for a heartbeat, I felt the old Amara, the village girl, want to collapse and howl. But then I looked at the truck. Two small, tear-streaked faces were pressed against the glass of the cab. Zuri and Zalika. They weren't looking at the fire. They were looking at me. They were waiting to see if their world was ending. I didn't howl. I didn't even cry. I walked straight up to Kofi. He flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, rusted key to the house. I dropped it into the dust at his feet. "You burnt the wood and the fabric, Kofi," I said, my voice so cold it seemed to quiet the roar of the flames. "But you can't burn the business I carry in my head. You can't burn the courage Malik gave me. You just freed me from the last thing I felt I owed this village." I turned my back on the fire. Malik's friends and the neighbors were already forming a bucket brigade, but I knew the bedroom was gone. I climbed into the truck, sat between my daughters, and pulled them into my lap. I smelled like smoke, but I held them with arms of steel. "Don't look back," I whispered into their hair. "We are going to a place where things don't burn." The drive to Nairobi was silent. The city lights began to appear on the horizon, a sprawling carpet of diamonds that didn't look like a threat anymore. They looked like a grid of opportunities. Malik took us to a 2-bedroom rental in a bustling part of the city. It was modest, bare floors and white walls, but it was mine. That first night, we slept on blankets on the floor. I stayed awake, my laptop glowing in the dark, my fingers flying across the keys. I messaged my suppliers. I updated my store. I transformed my rage into a marketing plan. I realized then that Kofi had done me a favor. By burning my past, he had made it impossible for me to ever crawl back. 6 months later, my Amara's Heritage online brand was the talk of the local craft scene. I wasn't just surviving. I was a storm. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It wasn't a lawyer's notice or a bill. It was a crumpled piece of paper with no return address, just a smudge of red village dust on the corner. I opened it, expecting a plea for money or a hollow apology from Kofi. Instead, the letter contained only a single photograph, an image of the acacia tree where we were married. But the tree had been chopped down, and in its place was a sign I never expected to see. I stared at the photo, my breath catching. The sign didn't have Kofi's name on it. It had a name that made the floor feel like it was tilting beneath my feet. The city did not welcome me with open arms. It welcomed me with a challenge. For the first few months, the smell of smoke followed me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my wedding bed turning to ash. But in the morning, the sun would hit the white walls of my 2-bedroom sanctuary, and I would remember, I am the one who survived. That I enrolled Zuri and Zalika in a local school. On their first day, they looked so small in their crisp navy blue uniforms, their braids tied with bright yellow ribbons. I watched them walk through those iron gates, and I wept, not out of sadness, but because for the first time, their future wasn't tied to the price of maize or the whims of my business. Amara's Heritage became my third child. I spent my days in the markets, negotiating with weavers, and my nights in front of the laptop Malik had given me. I wasn't just selling baskets and fabrics. I was selling the stories of the women who made them. I created a website where a woman in New York could buy a bag and read about the grandmother in Kenya who wove it. The orders started as a trickle, then a stream, then a flood. I hired 2 young women from the neighborhood to help with packaging. We worked in my living room, the air filled with the scent of dried sisal and the sound of laughter. I was no longer the village girl. I was Madame Amara. I remember the day I took the girls to the Nairobi National Park. As we watched the lions bask in the sun against the backdrop of the city skyscrapers, Zuri looked at me and said, "Mama, you look like a queen now." "No, my love," I replied. "I look like a woman who finally knows her name." But as my bank account grew and my name became known in the Nairobi business circles, a shadow from the past returned. A sleek car pulled up to my apartment building one evening. It wasn't Kofi. It was a man in a dark suit I didn't recognize, holding a legal folder that looked like a weapon. "Madam Amara," he asked, "I represent the estate of your late father-in-law. There is a matter of a hidden inheritance that your husband never told you about." The legal battle for the inheritance was short. It turned out my father-in-law had left a vast tract of land to me and the girls, knowing Kofi's character all too well. Kofi had tried to burn my life to hide the fact that I was already wealthier than he would ever be. With the settlement, I didn't buy jewelry. I bought a warehouse. It was during the construction of the Amara Heritage Center that I met David. David was the lead architect, a tall man with hands that looked like they knew the value of hard work and eyes that held the stillness of a deep lake. He didn't look at me like a beautiful African girl or a successful entrepreneur. He looked at me like I was a complex blueprint he wanted to understand. "You're building this with a lot of exits," he remarked one day, looking at the plans for the warehouse. "I like knowing I can leave whenever I want," I said, my voice sharp. David didn't flinch. He just nodded. "A building should be a choice, Amara, not a cage." Over the next year, our meetings moved from blueprints to coffee shops, and from coffee shops to Sunday walks at Karura Forest. He didn't rush me. He knew I had been burned, and he was content to be the cool rain. He loved my daughters not as a duty, but because they were brilliant, fierce little humans. One evening, under the city stars at a restaurant overlooking the Nairobi skyline, David didn't pull out a chair for me the way Kofi had for that woman. Instead, he stood beside me and asked, "Amara, I don't want to be your pillar. You are your own pillar. I just want to be the garden that grows around you. Will you marry me?" I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to check for an exit. Our wedding was at the Windsor Golf and Country Club. There was no red dust, only green grass and white lilies. My mother-in-law sat in the front row, wearing a dress I had designed for her, tears of joy streaming down her face. As we danced, I saw a figure standing far off near the gates, a man in a tattered coat, looking older than his years. It was Kofi. He stood there for a long time, watching the life he had thrown away glow with a light he could never touch. I didn't call the guards. I didn't even stop smiling. I simply turned my back and leaned into David, the music of my new life drowning out the ghosts of the old. But as the cake was being cut, Malik leaned into my ear. "Amara, there's a woman at the entrance. She says she's Sarah, and she says she has something of yours that Kofi stole." The name Sarah acted like a cold drop of water on a hot griddle. My heart skipped, but I didn't let the smile slip from my face. I looked at David, who caught the flicker of tension in my eyes. He squeezed my hand, a silent anchor. "Give me a moment," I whispered. I walked toward the gate, my white silk train whispering against the manicured grass. There she stood. She wasn't the polished city woman I remembered. The silk dress was gone, replaced by a simple cotton wrap. Her face was gaunt, the expensive glow extinguished by the harsh reality of living with a man like Kofi once his money ran out. "Amara," she rasped. She looked at me, the woman she had once pitied, and I saw a reflection of my old self in her eyes. The brokenness, the exhaustion. "Why are you here, Sarah?" I asked, my voice steady. She reached into a worn leather bag and pulled out a small, charred wooden box. My breath hitched. It was the music box my father had given me before he died, the one I thought had perished in the fire. "He didn't burn everything," she said, her voice trembling. "He kept the things he thought he could sell later. When he lost his job and started drinking, he tried to pawn this. I took it. I've been looking for you for months, but I was too ashamed." She handed it to me. The wood was blackened, but the mechanism inside rattled. "He's a hollow man, Amara. He tried to do to me what he did to you. But I didn't have a Malik. I didn't have a village. I just had the guilt of what I helped him do to you." I looked at the box, then at the woman who had been my viper. I realized that she wasn't the enemy. She was just another casualty of a man who didn't know how to love. "Sarah," I said, looking her in the eye, "the fire is out. For both of us." I reached into my clutch and pulled out a business card for the Amara Heritage Center. "Go there tomorrow. Ask for Malik. Tell him I sent you to join the weaving circle. We help women stand on their own feet there." She began to sob, quiet, shoulder-shaking heaves of relief. I didn't hug her, but I didn't turn her away. I watched her walk toward the gates, a little less heavy than she had arrived. Act 9. The legacy of the acacia. The wedding continued, but the air felt lighter. We danced until the Nairobi moon was high and silver. My daughters fell asleep in the arms of their new grandfathers, their yellow ribbons slightly wilted but their faces peaceful. Years passed. The Amara Heritage Center grew into a landmark. We didn't just export baskets, we exported dignity. I became a mentor for young women coming from the villages, teaching them that a smartphone could be a tool for freedom, and that their stories were their greatest currency. David and I built a home in the suburbs, a place filled with books, light, and the constant sound of the twins practicing their violins. We went back to the village once a year. I rebuilt my mother-in-law's house, not with mud and thatch, but with stone and solar panels. One evening, I walked out to the spot where the old acacia tree used to stand. A new sapling had been planted there, a gift from the village elders. It was small, but its roots were deep in the red soil. That I sat on a bench David had built for me and opened the charred music box. I had cleaned the soot and oiled the gears. I turned the key. A faint, tinkling melody began to play. It was a bit out of tune, scarred by the heat of the past, but it was beautiful. It was the sound of a woman who had been through the fire and came out as gold. I looked up to see Zuri and Zalika running toward me through the grass, their silhouettes tall and strong against the setting sun. Behind them, David was walking slowly, watching them with a pride that made my heart ache with gratitude. I realized then that the palace Kofi promised me was never meant to be built by him. It was a kingdom I had to build within myself, stone by stone, lie by lie, truth by truth. I closed the box. The song ended, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. It was mine. If you walk through the glass doors of the Amara Heritage Center today, you won't see a victim. You will see a woman who speaks in the language of data and dignity, whose name is whispered in the corridors of power and shouted in the markets where women finally own their stalls. The soot is gone from her fingernails, but the fire remains in her eyes. That Amara's life is no longer a clay pot. It is a skyscraper. She has built a kingdom where the daughters of the village are no longer waiting for men to return, but are instead building their own bridges to the future. Kofi remains a silhouette in the rearview mirror, a man who thought he could stop a river by throwing a stone. As the sun sets over Nairobi, painting the skyline in the same red as the village dust, Amara closes her eyes and listens to the hum of the city. It is a symphony of independence. She is no longer just a character in a story. She is the one holding the pen, and she has only just begun to write. If you like this story, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more inspiring stories.